In the quiet town where life moved slowly and people rarely noticed the little sacrifices made by others, there stood a small daycare building at the edge of the neighborhood, its lights still glowing long after the sun had disappeared behind the hills. And inside, Alana, a young black teacher with tired but gentle eyes, rocked a crying baby in her arms, her voice humming a soft lullaby that only the child could hear. And though the room was filled with tiny beds and toys scattered across the floor, the atmosphere was heavy with the sound of the baby's sobs that refused to quiet down. So instead of leaving him in the crib where he would cry himself to exhaustion, Alana lowered herself to the cold wooden floor, lying down on her back as she held the baby close to her chest. Her coat spread over his small body to keep him warm while she shivered in silence. And though her body ached from a long day, her mind was focused only on the fragile heartbeat pressed against her own. Because to her, no child should ever feel abandoned or alone, even if the world outside was too busy to care. The night stretched on, and the hum of the heating system barely covered the sound of her whispers as she sang stories of comfort and hope. Her words too soft to carry beyond the room, yet powerful enough to calm the restless child who finally gave in to sleep, his tiny hand curled into her shirt as if afraid she might vanish. And though exhaustion pulled at her, Alana closed her eyes for a moment, not realizing that a pair of sharp, watchful eyes were observing her from the doorway. Mr. Whitman, a billionaire whose fortune had built towers of glass and steel in cities far beyond this small town, had arrived unannounced that night to visit the daycare he had quietly funded with a donation months earlier, a place he had thought of as nothing more than another line on a report. Yet the sight before him routed him to the spot, his hand still on the doorknob as he watched a teacher lying on the bare floor with a child in her arms, shivering from the cold but refusing to move for her own comfort. And something in that scene pierced through the armor of wealth and detachment he had built over years of running empires. He should have walked away, should have cleared his throat to announce himself, but instead, he stayed hidden in the shadows of the hallway, his mind filled with questions he had never thought to ask, wondering why she would go to such lengths for someone else's child when most people would have simply walked away. And as the silence deepened, he realized that what he was witnessing was not duty, nor obligation, but something rarer, love without condition, sacrifice without applause. And it unsettled him in a way no business deal ever had. The clock ticked toward midnight, and he could see how her eyelids fluttered with sleep but never fully closed. How she shifted only to ensure the baby was comfortable. How she whispered words of comfort to no one but the child. And for the first time in years, Mr. Whitman felt small in the face of such quiet humanity, a feeling he carried with him as he finally stepped back into the night, his heart beating with questions he knew he could not ignore when morning came. The following morning carried the same ordinary rhythm for the daycare, with children running through the hall, their laughter echoing against the walls. But for Alana, the young teacher who had spent her night on the cold floor with a restless baby in her arms, her body was heavy though, her spirit tried to stay strong, and she greeted each parent with the same warm smile, hiding the fatigue behind her eyes, unaware that someone had been watching her sacrifice the night before and was now silently following her every move. Because Mr. Whitman, the billionaire who had stood in the shadows of the daycare doorway, had returned early in the morning. Not as a man of wealth dressed in his usual polished suit but in a plain coat that made him blend with the other parents, though no child inside belonged to him. And as he leaned against the frame of the window that overlooked the playroom, he studied the way Alana bent down to tie a toddler's shoe, how she knelt patiently to listen to a child's story about their toy car, and how her smile never faltered even though her hands trembled slightly from the exhaustion of her sleepless night. He told himself he was only curious, only trying to understand the kind of dedication that would drive someone to sacrifice their own comfort for children that were not her own. Yet the longer he stayed, the more questions filled his mind, and he began to notice small details others ignored, like the way her shoes were worn out from constant movement, the patched fabric on her sweater that hinted at struggles she never spoke of, and the small notebook tucked into her bag where she scribbled lesson plans during her short breaks instead of resting. The children adored her, their little hands pulling at her sleeves, their voices calling her name with pure affection, and in their eyes he saw the reflection of something he himself had not felt in years: trust, simple and unshaken, built not from wealth or promises but from the consistent love she gave them. And though the room was filled with color and laughter, he noticed the quiet way she would step aside, pressing a hand to her back when no one was looking, trying to ease the pain of long hours, yet always standing again before anyone could see her weakness. Mr. Whitman thought of how many of his employees at his companies spoke to him with polished words and eager faces, motivated by paychecks and promotions, but this woman, who owned nothing of his world, carried a strength he could not buy, and for the first time in years he did not feel like the one in control. Because here, in this small daycare, he was the observer, and she was the teacher of something he had forgotten existed. The suspense of his own silence pressed heavily on him, for he wanted to step forward, to introduce himself not as the man who had written the check to fund the daycare, but as someone who wanted to understand her world. Yet he held back, testing himself with patience, telling himself to watch a little longer, to learn before he acted, because he knew that one wrong word could break the fragile authenticity of what he saw. And so he watched as hours passed, until the children were picked up one by one, their parents rushing through with hurried thanks. And only when the last child was gone did Alana sit down at the small table, her head dropping onto her arms, for just a moment of stolen rest, her breath slow and heavy with exhaustion. And it was then that Mr. Whitman, standing in the quiet hallway with his hand on the glass, realized that he could no longer remain hidden, that his silence had stretched too far, and that whatever came next would demand not only his wealth but his heart. For the woman he had been watching was not someone to pity, but someone whose strength challenged everything he thought he knew. And in that moment, as the clock ticked louder in the empty building, he prepared to finally step into her world, though even he did not know what his first words would be. That evening, when the last golden rays of the sun slipped through the daycare windows and stretched across the empty room, Alana was still cleaning up, carefully stacking toys, wiping little tables, and gathering blankets left behind by children who had gone home hours ago. And she thought she was alone, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway made her pause, her heart giving a small jump before she turned to see Mr. Whitman standing in the doorway, not dressed in his usual image of power but with a calm, almost uncertain look. And when she met his eyes, she sensed that this was not just another parent passing through, but someone carrying a purpose that she could not yet understand. And though her instinct told her to smile politely and offer help, his silence held weight, the kind that fills a room with unanswered questions. So she waited, her hand still resting on the cloth she had been folding, until he finally spoke, his voice low but steady, saying he had seen her the night before, lying on the floor beside the crying baby, and he had returned to watch her again, because what he saw had unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Alana froze, unsure whether to be embarrassed, angry, or grateful, because the thought of being watched felt strange, yet there was no malice in his tone, only curiosity mixed with something softer. And when he admitted that he had been standing outside the glass that morning, studying the way she worked, she felt her cheeks grow warm. But before she could ask him why, he told her a truth she never expected. He was the one who funded the daycare, not the community, not the small government grant they had believed in, but him, a billionaire who had signed the checks quietly, thinking it was just another project, another tax benefit, until he saw her. And now he realized money alone meant nothing without people like her who gave it meaning. The revelation hit her like a wave. For all this time she had thought of him as just another wealthy man disconnected from ordinary life. But here he was, standing in front of her, confessing that her quiet sacrifice had opened his eyes to something. His billions had never bought genuine human care, though she wanted to brush it off. To say she was simply doing her job, he stopped her with a question that pierced her heart. Why did she give so much of herself, even when no one was watching, even when her body was tired, and her life outside these walls was clearly not easy? For a moment, Alana could not speak, because no one had ever asked her that before, and the silence between them grew heavy until she finally whispered that the children reminded her of her younger self, a child who once sat in rooms like these, waiting for a parent who never came, comforted only by the kindness of one teacher who believed in her. And from that moment she had promised herself that no child under her care would ever feel unseen. And though the weight of her struggles was great, the thought of breaking that promise hurt more. As her words filled the room, Mr. Whitman felt something shift inside him, a quiet cracking of the armor he had worn for years, and he remembered his own childhood, not of struggle but of emptiness. Raised in mansions filled with wealth but lacking warmth, and suddenly the lines between their worlds blurred, because despite their different journeys, both had grown up carrying the invisible scars of loneliness. And for the first time, he realized that perhaps money was not the measure of value, but the heart one poured into others. The air in the room grew heavier with the weight of truth, yet it was not uncomfortably, it was awakening, and, though neither of them said it aloud, both felt that something had begun to change, something neither could undo. And as the clock ticked closer to night, Alana looked at him with cautious eyes and asked why he had chosen to reveal this to her now. And he replied simply that sometimes life puts people in front of you not to pass by, but to teach you what you had forgotten. And she was teaching him, without even trying, what it meant to give without expecting anything in return. She wanted to deny it, to shake her head and return to her work, but deep down she knew his words carried truth. And though the world outside remained the same, loud streets, busy lives, restless ambition inside that small daycare room, something invisible had shifted, a connection born not of status or power, but of shared humanity. And as they stood there in the fading light, both knew that this revelation was not the end, but only the beginning of a journey neither had expected to take. The next morning arrived, with a quiet chill in the air, and Alana felt uneasy as she walked into the daycare, not because of the children or the usual work that awaited her, but because of the strange weight of her conversation with Mr. Whitman the night before. And though she tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, the truth was that everything had, because now she knew the man behind the funding. And worse, he knew her truth as well, leaving her heart exposed in ways she was not used to. But she had little time to dwell, for soon the daycare filled with laughter, tiny footsteps, and the chaos of toys. Yet through it all, her mind kept wandering back to him, wondering if he would return, and what it might mean if he did. She did not have to wonder long, because just before noon, he appeared at the doorway again, dressed not in his polished business suit but in a plain sweater and slacks, almost as if he wanted to blend in, and the sight of him there startled not only Alana but also the other staff, who whispered curiously among themselves, unsure why a billionaire would visit twice in 2 days. And as he walked toward her, she felt the weight of 100 unspoken questions pressing against her chest. He carried with him a proposal, though not in the form of contracts or money, but in words that made her throat tighten. He wanted to know if she would help him create something greater than just a building, a place that gave children more than food and safety, a place that gave them hope, guidance, and a sense of belonging. And though his voice carried confidence, there was a rawness beneath it, as if he were truly asking for her help, not as a billionaire asking an employee, but as a man asking another human being to share in a vision. Alana's heart pounded, because the idea was noble, and her soul longed to say yes, but she knew promises like these came with trials, and she had seen too many grand plans collapse when money lost interest or when reality grew too heavy. So, she told him with firm honesty that such a path would test not their wallets, but their hearts, and many people failed that test once the glow of inspiration faded. For the first time, he did not respond quickly. Instead, he looked down, silent, as though her words had struck a hidden nerve. And then he admitted something she never expected, that he, too, was unsure if his heart could carry it, because, while money had always solved his problems, this would be different. This would demand patience, empathy, and humility, qualities he feared he had not yet mastered. But still he wanted to try, because seeing her with the children had awakened. A part of him, he thought, was long gone. His confession made her chest ache, for beneath all his wealth he sounded like a lost child, searching for something he could not name. And she realized that perhaps the test of heart was not hers alone, but his as well, and if they were to walk this road, they would both need to face it together. But the test arrived sooner than either expected, for later that same day, when one of the children fell ill, and panic swept through the room, Alana rushed to cradle the crying boy, her hands steady even as his breathing grew shallow, and without hesitation, she directed others to call for help, while Mr. Whitman, standing nearby, froze, his face pale and unsure, unused to moments where wealth meant nothing and only courage could act. Alana's eyes met his, and though she spoke no words, her look demanded that he step forward, that he prove he could be more than an observer. And with trembling hands, he bent down beside her, holding the boy's small hand as she soothed him, whispering calm words until the ambulance arrived. And in that moment, the billionaire felt the raw weight of responsibility, not in numbers or contracts, but in the fragile pulse of a child depending on him. When the boy was finally taken away, safe and stable, the room exhaled in relief, and Mr. Whitman sat back against the wall, his eyes wet, as if he had been stripped of all the illusions of power and left only with the truth that real strength was not in what you owned but in what you gave of yourself. Alana watched him quietly, and though she said nothing, her heart whispered that this was the true test, the moment that revealed the measure of a man. And though he had stumbled at first, he had chosen to rise, to stand beside her in the fire, and that, she knew, was the beginning of something that could not easily be undone. The room returned to its normal rhythm, toys clattering, children laughing, but both Alana and Mr. Whitman knew that the day had carved something permanent into their lives, and as he stood to leave, his hand brushing against the doorframe, he looked back at her with an expression that carried no wealth, no pride, only humility and a quiet plea for trust. And though she gave no answer, the softness in her eyes told him that perhaps he had passed the first trial of the heart, and many more would follow. The days that followed the incident at the daycare carried a quiet shift that was almost invisible at first, yet anyone who watched closely would have felt it, for Alana walked into work each morning with the same steady, handsome calm smile, but deep inside her, there was now an unshakable awareness that her path had merged with something far larger than she had ever imagined. And as for Mr. Whitman, the man who once walked through life with polished detachment, he returned again and again, not as the billionaire benefactor who handed out checks, but as a man willing to roll up his sleeves, sit on the floor with the children, listen to their laughter, and face his own weakness in the mirror of their trust. And though at first the staff whispered, unsure of his reasons, they soon saw that this was no passing fancy, for each visit lasted longer, each conversation, with Alana, carried more depth, and with every passing day his heart seemed to loosen from the heavy armor of pride he had carried for so long. Yet even as new beginnings formed, suspense hung in the air, for building something meaningful was never free of shadows, and Alana knew it, which was why she kept her guard steady, testing him in ways that were never cruel but always real, watching If he would keep coming when the children were noisy, when the work was messy, and when the smiles were mixed with tears, and to her own quiet surprise, he stayed. And in staying, he began to transform, not only himself, but the entire daycare. For soon ideas that once seemed like fragile dreams started to take root. New books filled the shelves, healthy meals appeared on tables, safe play areas replaced broken corners, and most importantly, the children felt seen. Not as a project, but as individuals whose futures mattered. Still, the true turning point came one rainy afternoon, when a storm battered the city and the power went out, leaving the building dark and the children restless with fear. And it was then, as shadows stretched across the walls, that the old Whitman, the one who solved problems with money, might have called his assistant to fix things. But the new Whitman reached into the darkness and joined Alana on the floor, lighting a small flashlight and turning the moment into a game of shadows, where his once intimidating presence melted into the shape of a playful bear, and the children's shrieks of fear turned into giggles, filling the room with warmth that no storm could chase away. Alana, watching from the side, felt a lump in her throat, for in that moment she saw the final proof that he had stepped into the light of change. Not for the sake of appearances, but because his heart had chosen it, and she realized her own test had ended, for she no longer needed to doubt what she saw. When the storm passed and the power returned, the daycare glowed not just with electricity, but with a sense of new beginning, and Mr. Whitman, sitting among the children, looked up at Alana with quiet eyes that held both gratitude and something deeper, as though he, too, had been rescued, not by wealth or success, but by the simple courage of a woman who had never stopped giving, even when no one was watching. From that day on, the future unfolded in steps that carried both suspense and wonder, as the daycare slowly grew into a model of hope, drawing attention from people across the city. But at its heart, it was not the building or the funds that defined it, but the bond between a teacher who sacrificed quietly and a man who learned that love, in its truest form, could never be bought, only lived. And so, the new beginning was not just for the children, but for both of them, as they walked forward into a story still unwritten, hand in hand with the weight of the past behind them and the promise of tomorrow before them.